Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you both, Joanne and Michael, for the invitation. I don't have direct experience with rare diseases, but as I was mentioning to Kat earlier, my younger brother's autistic, and low-functioning autistic. So I understand the human cost, I understand the societal cost, and it's one of the reasons I really, after having the first discussion with Joanne, decided this was something that was really worth coming to, and seeing if we can do a little something to help out, maybe find some collaborations that make sense to some of the folks in the room. I run what's called the Northeast Big Data Hub, and the Northeast Big Data Hub is a National Science Foundation program. It's a national program with 4 hubs around the country. We happen to be the Northeast Hub, and each hub is hosted at a major academic institution that has a strong data science presence. So for us, we're hosted at Columbia University, and we're part of the Data Science Institute in a way. But we're clear to say hosted because we're not exclusively in the service of our host institutions, and you'll see a little bit more about that in a second. The other thing that I'll mention, folks in the room probably don't know her, but I'm very fortunate to have Kathy McEwen, who's a world-renowned expert in natural language processing, machine learning, etc., as our principal investigator, and she's been extraordinarily helpful to the hub. So, as I mentioned, we're that red dot there. We're in Manhattan at Columbia University. These are the 9 states of the Northeast that are our responsibility, although early on we discovered that a lot of the challenges, and we'll talk a little bit about those in a second, a lot of the challenges that we're addressing are really national in scope. So we do a lot of collaboration across the 4 different hubs. But the primary responsibility for our hub is the Northeast, so I've done a lot of work with almost all of the states, although I still have to get out to Rhode Island, but they're on the list for this year. The other thing that I'll mention is that the common mission of the hubs is to try to identify large challenges that require multi-sector data-driven solutions and to help build the partnerships that create those solutions and then to help them disseminate those solutions. So this is, even though there are some differences between the hubs and the areas that we cover and in some cases in how we operate, this is a shared mission for all of us. So this is a little bit general, and then I'll talk about health specifically in one of our projects in the healthcare space. So these are the areas that we cover. So you see there's the concentric circles there. The ones in the middle show you what our vertical priority areas are. So when we first started, the idea was for us to go out into the community. So I'm depending on which side of the equation you're from, I'm either a failed entrepreneur or an experienced entrepreneur. So I tend to look at things with an entrepreneurial cap on. And as an entrepreneur, you try not to build things that people don't actually want. So this is sometimes difficult when you're dealing in academia and discovery research, because that's the point of discovery research, is to follow the curiosity. But when you're trying to move over the transom into government or industry, etc., that doesn't always translate very well. So I try to look at things first by going out into the community, understanding where we might be able to add value, and then coming back and trying to build programs that actually help to meet the needs and the challenges the communities are facing. So that's the way we started the hub 2.5 years ago. We went out into the community. Fortunately, there was a lot of need. Unfortunately, this is a lot of ground to cover. So we have these 5 vertical areas and 4 horizontal areas, which are enabling areas. I won't, they're fairly self-explanatory, but health is one of our big areas. We also have smart cities, discovery science, education, etc. And then the 4 horizontal areas are, we believe, critically important to enabling any of these verticals to succeed. So this includes data sharing for obvious reasons, but also data literacy, and we define data literacy pretty broadly, not just technical data science literacy, but also helping practitioners who don't want to become data scientists understand how to even think about using data science approaches in their work, whether they're a head of a government agency or somebody in industry or folks who are doing research in academia, either on the hard science side or social sciences, etc. So it's a pretty broad definition. Also includes the general public. So all of these things we think are important in order for data science adoption to happen at the scale that we're hoping it'll happen. So that's a really important one. And then privacy, security, and ethics are also really important components. As I'm sure everybody's seen in the news lately, the ethics has been rearing its ugly head. And there are a lot of challenges to be overcome there, so this is a very active area for us as well. So I mentioned, given the time I won't belabor this too much, but I mentioned that these nine Northeast states that I cover, I've been pounding the pavement a lot over the last 2.5 years, doing a lot of what we call customer discovery in the startup world. So 10 cities so far, from Pittsburgh to Portsmouth. And part of what we've been trying to do is, as I mentioned earlier, understand stakeholder needs, figure out what data resources are available, and we launched a project this year that's trying to address that, which I'll talk about in a minute. And also trying to explore different ways of becoming self-sustaining as we grow our mission. So we have some nice seed funding from the National Science Foundation, but we don't expect that that's going to last forever. So we're trying to provide enough value that we can attract the revenue. And this doesn't mean we're a for-profit, we're not, and never will be. But there are different ways of attracting revenue based on the value we're providing that we're exploring all of the different hubs, both independently and collectively. So over the last 2.5 years, we've launched 3 big projects in those priority areas. We call them spoke projects to keep with the hub and spoke analogy. We've launched 4 planning projects in different areas. The 3 big projects are $1 million projects. One's in health, one is in education, and the other one is in data sharing. All of our projects are multi-sector projects, as you'll see in a minute. So that's where our sweet spot is. We don't really engage in projects in which an individual university or an individual company or government agency can get the project off the ground and run it on their own. Really where our sweet spot is that intersection of sectors, when a problem is large enough, a challenge is large enough that it requires a multi-sector solution. We've done a lot of stuff with innovator internships, and I'll talk a little bit about these other 2 projects, the Big Data Map project and the Cybersecurity Risk project, before moving on to the next slide. So Big Data Map, as I went out into the community and started speaking with folks across the different sectors, it became very clear that regardless of where I went, and obviously there was a range, but regardless of where I went, folks didn't really have a good understanding of what data science resources were available to them. If you're speaking to astrophysicists, maybe they're pretty well versed, but in industry and government, et cetera, there was a real gap. So I got together with the other hubs to see if they were experiencing a similar challenge, and they were. So we concocted the notion of a big data map, and the idea there is, can we help these communities by mapping out what resources are available on the data side, on the hardware and software side, on the people side. So where is the talent that you need to tap in order to launch one of these projects or to solve a challenge that you have? So we divided and conquered. The West Hub is doing the people piece, the South Hub is doing the software and the hardware piece of this mapping, and we're doing the data piece. We're doing the data piece, though, with a little bit of a twist. I'll talk about that. I need to check my slides since I completed them only 2 days ago. So the data piece we're doing with a little bit of a twist. Rather than focusing on just aggregating data sets for the sake of aggregating data sets, we said, we have limited resources and we want to use those resources effectively. Really, a lot of cities, for example, New York City has, I think now, over 1,400 data sets in their open data repository, of which really a small fraction are actually useful for anything. So we didn't want to do that. We said the data sets that are most important are the ones where there are challenges that people are already trying to solve, use cases that are understandable use cases for which maybe there are data sets that are applicable. So we're designing a platform now that focuses on the use cases. So we're going out there and gathering use cases and any associated data sets that people have. And then there's a very strong crowdsourcing element to it as well. In the data world, for those of you who don't know, metadata, the notion of data about the data, is extremely important. It helps you find the data sets that are relevant to what you're trying to do. It defines what's contained in those data sets so that you understand whether it's something that you really want to dig into if you're trying to create a machine learning solution, for example. The problem with metadata schemas is that A, there are so many to choose from, and B, they're extremely dense. So if you speak to folks in the machine learning world, they'll say, we don't really want to traverse these very dense schemas. We want to try to understand just enough about what's in that data set to decide whether we want to play with it or not. So we decided to take this to heart, and we're opening up the tagging of this data to the community of solvers who would engage, for example, in a smart city transportation project. So the folks who are in that world already, tell us what you think is important about that data. We'll do a little bit of curation on top of that and create what we call metadata light. And in addition to that, we're going to open up whatever challenges are posted to the community of solvers. So the hope here is if we can build critical mass, we can create a recommender system so that when somebody posts a challenge, we can already tell them what data sets are relevant and what solutions may be relevant to that challenge. The final one is addressing, in some ways, the privacy and security, in some ways, the ethics challenges that we're seeing out in the world. As you can imagine with the things that have been going on with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, et cetera, everybody out there, every organization would love to have cybersecurity liability insurance. One of the challenges is that the insurance industry doesn't really know how to underwrite cybersecurity risk because they don't really understand cybersecurity risk. So we're at the very beginning of a pilot project to try to gather the stakeholders, not just in insurance because it's actually a larger problem than insurance, but it's a great place to start because it's tractable and it can really make an impact in moving the entire area along. So we're working with insurance providers, with some of the big brokers, and with companies themselves that are either vendors in the cybersecurity space or companies that actually are trying to secure their companies from a cybersecurity perspective, to try to understand where the real challenges are in understanding cybersecurity risk, what are the data requirements, and see if we can build a resource that begins to address this type of a challenge. So now, on to healthcare. So one of our big projects is a project that's being run out of a Harvard Medical School in collaboration with Columbia University, a number of government agencies, so kind of keeping with our MO of operating across sectors in the sense of large challenges. So the idea here is to try to build a search engine that addresses one of the big challenges in healthcare research. Actually, two of the big challenges in healthcare research. One is that predominantly healthcare research takes place using clinical data repositories and genomic data repositories. But if you look at any given disease, in many cases, less than 50% of the disease is attributable to genetic factors. So there's a whole world of data out there that hasn't been tapped as effectively as it can be to try to understand disease. We're calling this the exposome data set. So it includes environmental exposure to allergens and toxins, migration patterns, social demographic factors, et cetera. The other challenge in healthcare research is that, by and large, healthcare research is correlation-based. So we're working with the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Pittsburgh to try to create causal analytics engines on top of a combined data set that includes the exposome database that's being built at Harvard Medical School and a large consortia called the Odyssey Consortia, which happens to be run out of Columbia, but is a consortia of, I think, 40-plus institutions around the world that represent a combined 700 million patient records. This is observational health records. So the idea here is that phenotype, and you can look at the different diseases there, is really a combination of genome and environment. So that's part of what this project is trying to address. So the notion here is how can we drive discovery of environmental factors in disease phenotype and enhance the accessibility in clinical and environmental data using AI tools. So this is for those of you who don't know it, this is really a fantastic resource. It's still relatively new, so there's some automation that I think they're working on trying to incorporate into the tool. But as I said, it represents something in the neighborhood of 700 million patient records. The way that it operates is in a distributed manner, so it's a federated set of data. So it's not a centralized data repository, which essentially sidesteps a lot of the privacy and security challenges there. So any researcher that wants to perform research on this data set writes their code, deposits it on something called GitHub, which is a very popular place to deposit code nowadays, and then puts it out into the network that they're trying to perform this research. Any institution that is willing to run that code on their data does it and then gives back the results to the researcher. So it's a really novel way of trying to sidestep some of the challenges from a privacy and security perspective. It represents these different organizations around the world, so it's pretty widely distributed. So you see it's not just North America and Europe, although that is predominantly where the data comes from, but it includes elements of institutions in Asia, in Australia, and in Africa as well. So this is kind of, I won't get too far into this, but I think everybody here probably gets the general idea. How do we get to the phenomic information about the disease? So one piece of this is the health record from your doctors, from your physicians. Where do we get the environmental data? So there's a lot of different sources here. So this project is working, and can you see? Okay. It was showing up as black text on this screen. I'm sorry for the animation. I actually borrowed this slide and didn't realize it had this much animation in it. So we're working with multiple government agencies already. So we're working with NOAA, with the CDC, with the Census Bureau, et cetera, EPA. So you see all of these different types of data are being incorporated into the exposome database at Harvard. Just in the interest of time, I'll skip this. The general idea is this is trying to show a lot of integrated data. So there are sensors involved here, there's census data, all of that sort of thing. So just to give you a sense, and this is probably too far in the weeds for this audience, but just to give you a sense of the architecture here, there's cloud computing in the middle, so everybody probably is aware of Amazon Web Services as one of the big cloud computing providers. There's a lot of infrastructure that's been built here, which incorporates the data, as you see on the left, from the Census Bureau's ACS group, from NOAA, from the EPA. And there's an API client, which this represents, which makes it relatively easy to tap into this data set and to use it in different ways. And coming soon, for those of you who work in the data space, if there are any of you, is integration with Python, with Jupyter Notebooks, which will make this really easier to use. So what are the new things in the work? As I said, we just launched the Big Data Map and the Cybersecurity Risk Pilot. We're also launching, we're in conversations right now with one of the major New York City companies, which you will recognize, but I can't say until we sign an agreement with them, on data literacy and workforce preparedness in data sciences. So this is a big project that we hope we'll be able to launch in the next year. And we're also working with organizations like Bloomberg on the company side, a lot of federal agencies, on data ethics, understanding how we can move the needle to create a code of data ethics, for example, to help organizations see the unforeseen consequences that they may not be taking into account in the way that they handle their data. So these are hopefully coming soon in the next year or two. I won't focus on these things. We've done a lot of convening. We've done a lot of outreach. This represents a selection of the different organizations that are in our orbit right now. These aren't all partnerships, but they're all fairly advanced discussions that we're having with these different entities, all the way up to actually formal partnerships. So you'll see a lot of names that you recognize there. Depending on which university you went to, you might recognize some of these logos, but there are a lot more than fit on this page. A lot of government agencies from the federal level down to the city level, and a number of nonprofits organizations that are already partners with us or engaged with us in some way. In the interest of time, I won't go too far into this, but this is an example of the type of project that the hubs put on. This was a cross-hub project with the Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration. You see a lot of companies in there that you'll recognize, Microsoft, Amazon. A company, interestingly enough, called Satori, which, if you've ever seen Arnold Schwarzenegger in a video game app commercial, this is the company behind this video game, which is called something like Missile Launch. The interesting part about it is that they've become very good at taking streaming data, high volumes of streaming data, and working with that data to come to different conclusions about the gaming world, and they're now trying to leverage that in other spaces, including in transportation. So the benefit that we have at being across sectors and being across different verticals is that we get to connect the dots in these ways, and it's a fairly unique set of organizations because we haven't come across any others that do quite the same thing. In fact, we're being studied by a group of ethnographers and science historians because there's never been something quite like the hub program. So hopefully we'll draw some interesting conclusions over the next few years about how we operate and what are the best practices for this type of organization. So the final thing I'll leave you with, it's a theme that I've heard a few times today. It's not just about technology. So we say technology. In this room it may be more about biology and the biotech, but even for us, we're dealing in zeros and ones. But at the end of the day, the people piece of this has to be front and center. And for us at the Northeast Hub, it very much is. So number one, we have to understand that we're creating solutions for people. We have to understand how this fits into their lives. We do things that are on the industry side, on the government side, and on the general public side. So what are the impacts? What are the ethical considerations? How do we help organizations, large companies or small companies, understand how to integrate this into their workflow in a way that makes it easy for them? A lot of the challenges that we see are actually not technological challenges, they're people challenges. They're cultural challenges, organizational challenges, not invented here challenges. I'll leave you with a final story, which is not in the biotech space, but kind of illustrates the point. I was working with New York City, with the mayor's office and the Department of Buildings, with a group of data scientists who had an idea for building a platform to track elevator data. So on the surface you say elevator data, I mean it's just up and down, right? Actually, if you think about New York City and the number of elevators in New York City, it's an extraordinarily rich data stream. It gives you information on energy use, it gives you information on the status of those elevators, whether they're working, functioning properly or not, people movement, and there's a lot that goes into it. So we were going to create a platform for them and a dashboard for the Department of Buildings to really understand what's going on with the elevators across the city. I got through the lawyers and the legal. They agreed we're going to do this, it makes sense, right? That was the first hurdle. We got through all of the managers with the exception of the chief elevator inspector. I couldn't get the guy to come to a meeting, I couldn't get him on the phone. So finally I cornered him and I said, I don't understand, we're trying to help you, we're trying to make this easier for you. And he says, yeah, you think you're trying to help me. Here's the problem, I've got a limited budget with limited resources. You're going to surface all of the problems with the elevator system that I don't already know about, and I'm not going to get additional resources to solve them. So it's all going to be my fault when I know about a problem that I couldn't solve. And this is a great illustration about how you have to understand the people, the social aspect of what you're doing when you apply any sort of technology, whether it's the zeros and ones or the biotechnology. Ultimately, we turned it around by saying, look, we don't have to open this up to the entire Department of Buildings. We can open it up to you for testing, and you can greenlight it or not, and maybe it's a way for you to help make the case that you need additional resources and additional funding. But that's the story I'll leave you with. I mean, we're very focused, even as a technology organization, on the people aspect of what we do.